Some secrets are buried so deep that even love can't dig them out without destroying everything in its path. On a freezing April night 18 years ago, two babies shared the same fate in the same castle, but only one of them would survive to see morning. A queen, consumed by grief over a loss too devastating to speak aloud, made a choice that would haunt 3 lives forever. A choice born not from cruelty, but from the kind of desperation that turns good people into liars and transforms a single moment of weakness into decades of deception. Now, nearly 2 decades later, a dying woman collapses at those same castle gates, carrying with her a truth that will shatter a princess's entire world. What started as an act of mercy is about to become the cruelest revelation imaginable. Because sometimes the worst lies are the ones we tell ourselves we're telling out of love. And when a mother and daughter finally stand face to face after 18 years of searching, neither of them will recognize what they've been looking for, because the answer has been hiding in plain sight all along. The note that was left that frozen night contained only a desperate plea for mercy. But the real message, the one that would take 18 years to understand, wasn't written in ink. It was written in blood, in sacrifice, and in a love so complicated it would force everyone involved to answer an impossible question. When the truth destroys everything you thought you knew about yourself, is ignorance really the greater sin? The Queen's scream tore through the stone corridors of Ravensmont Castle like a wounded animal seeking mercy it would never find. In the royal chamber, surrounded by blood-soaked linens and the acrid smell of sweat mixed with desperation, Queen Marguerite clutched the tiny, still body against her chest. The baby's skin had already begun to turn the bluish-gray color that marked the boundary between this world and whatever lay beyond. Her daughter, her only daughter, born silent into a world that had waited 9 months to celebrate her arrival. Helwise, the royal midwife, stood frozen near the window, her wrinkled hands still trembling from the failed attempt to coax breath into those perfect miniature lungs. 43 years she had been bringing lives into the world, and never once had she felt this particular brand of terror. Not for the dead infant, though that grief sat heavy in her chest like a stone. No, her fear came from something far more immediate and dangerous. She knew what happened to midwives who delivered dead heirs to the throne. She had seen the hangman's rope claim 2 of her predecessors for lesser failures. The king would return from the northern borders in 3 days. 3 days to present him with the heir he had demanded, the child he had promised to his nobles, the princess whose birth had already been announced by royal decree to every corner of the kingdom. King Edmund had waited 18 years for this moment. 18 years of stillborn sons, of miscarriages that left the queen hollow-eyed and silent for months, of whispered prayers in chapel alcoves, of increasingly desperate pilgrimages to distant shrines. This pregnancy had been different. The queen had carried full term. The royal physicians had sworn they heard a strong heartbeat just hours before labor began. And now this impossible, devastating silence. Marguerite rocked back and forth, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. With sweat, her nightgown soaked through with fluids that smelled of iron and salt and the bitter herbs Helwise had burned to ease the pain. She made no sound now. The screaming had given way to something worse, a terrible, airless grief that seemed to pull all oxygen from the room. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer, or might have been nothing at all. Just the mechanical motion of a mind trying to escape a reality too cruel to accept. Helwise moved toward her, each step feeling like walking through deep water. She needed to take the body, to prepare it, to do what had to be done before the tiny limbs stiffened and the truth became impossible to hide. But as she reached for the bundle, the queen's eyes snapped up. For a moment, Helwise saw something in that gaze that made her blood run cold. Not grief, not anymore. Something sharper, more dangerous. The look of a woman calculating impossible odds. Then came the sound that would change everything. A thin, reedy wail cut through the night air. Both women froze. The cry came from beyond the chamber door, from somewhere in the dark corridor outside. It was the unmistakable sound of a newborn infant. Hungry, cold, alive. Helwise reached the door first, yanking it open with strength that belied her 72 years. There, on the cold stone floor, wrapped in a threadbare woolen blanket that had been patched so many times it was more stitches than original fabric, lay a baby girl. Her face was red and scrunched with fury, her tiny fists waving at the injustice of being abandoned. Next to her lay a scrap of parchment, the writing barely legible in the flickering torchlight. The midwife snatched up both child and note, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She stepped back into the chamber and kicked the door shut with her heel, her mind already racing ahead to the terrible, magnificent possibility that had just presented itself. The baby in her arms screamed louder, and the sound seemed to fill every corner of the room, drowning out the deafening silence of the infant in the Queen's arms. Marguerite looked up. Their eyes met across the space of perhaps 6 feet that suddenly felt like the edge of a chasm. On one side lay grief, failure, and very possibly death. On the other side lay salvation, wrapped in someone else's blanket. The Queen's arms tightened around her dead daughter, and for a heartbeat, Helwise thought she would refuse, thought she would cling to that cold little body and face whatever consequences came. But then Marguerite's gaze dropped to the living child in Helwise's arms. The baby had stopped crying and was making small, snuffling sounds as she rooted against the midwife's bony shoulder, seeking milk, seeking warmth, seeking the mother who had left her on cold stone and walked away. The Queen's face did something complicated, something that looked like horror and hope engaging in brutal combat across her features. "How long?" Marguerite's voice came out as a whisper. "How long has she been there?" "I don't know, Your Majesty." Helwise moved closer, close enough that the Queen could see the abandoned baby's face clearly, close enough to smell the slightly sour scent of a newborn who needed washing. "But she's healthy, strong. Listen to those lungs." As if on cue, the infant began to wail again, her whole body vibrating with the force of her displeasure. The sound seemed to physically pain the Queen, who flinched and looked away. But she didn't say no. She didn't order Helwise to take both children away and summon the king's advisors to deliver the devastating news. She just sat there, holding death in her arms, while life screamed 3 feet away. Helwise made the decision for both of them. She had to. In perhaps 30 seconds, a guard would hear the crying and investigate. In perhaps 2 minutes, word would spread through the castle that a baby had been found. In perhaps 5 minutes, it would be too late to do what needed to be done. The midwife crossed the room and knelt beside the Queen, setting the living baby on the edge of the blood-soaked bed. Then, with hands that had delivered over 3,000 infants into the world, she gently pried the dead princess from her mother's arms. Marguerite let her go. That was the thing Helwise would remember for the rest of her days. The Queen let her go, not easily, not without a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest that human voices shouldn't be able to reach. But she released her daughter's body and watched as Helwise wrapped it carefully in clean linen, tucking the tiny face out of sight, bundling the evidence of their failure into something that could be hidden, could be buried in secret, could disappear. The midwife picked up the abandoned baby and placed her in the Queen's empty arms. The child was warm, so impossibly warm compared to the cold bundle Helwise now held. The baby immediately turned her face toward Marguerite's chest, seeking food with the blind, desperate instinct of all newborns. Her small hand curled around the Queen's finger, gripping with surprising strength. And Marguerite looked down at this stranger's child and began to weep. 18 years had passed since that night, and Queen Marguerite still woke sometimes with the phantom weight of cold skin against her chest. She would lie in the darkness of her chamber, listening to the wind howl through the castle towers, and wonder if the guilt would ever stop gnawing at her insides like a rat trapped in a grain sack. The answer, she knew, was no. Some sins were too large to digest. They simply lived inside you, growing heavier with each passing year, until you weren't sure anymore where the sin ended and you began. Princess Adrienne had grown into a beautiful young woman, though beautiful in a way that had always unsettled Marguerite in ways she could never quite articulate. The girl had copper-colored hair that caught sunlight like polished, metal, nothing like the queen's own dark waves or the king's wheat blonde locks. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, flecked with green, and they held a sharpness that seemed to see through pretense and ceremony straight to the uncomfortable truth beneath. She moved through the castle with a restlessness that no amount of etiquette training could smooth away, as if some part of her remembered being left on cold stone and had never quite forgiven the world for it. The king had died 7 years ago, thrown from his horse during a hunt. Marguerite had wept at his funeral, and the tears had been real, though not for the reasons the court assumed. She had cried because now there was no one left who remembered what she had been like before that night. No one who had known the woman who wanted a child so desperately she would commit an act that still made her hands shake when she thought about it too directly. Edmund had never learned the truth, had died believing Adrian was his blood, his legacy, his triumph over years of failed pregnancies. Sometimes Marguerite thought that ignorance had been her final gift to him. Other times she thought it had been her greatest cowardice. The morning broke cold and gray over Ravensmont, the kind of autumn day where the mist clung to the castle walls like something alive and hungry. Marguerite stood at her chamber window, watching servants hurry across the courtyard below, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She had barely slept. Again. The dreams had returned with a viciousness they hadn't possessed in years. Dreams where her real daughter's face appeared in mirrors, in reflections on water, asking questions Marguerite had no answers for. "Where are my 18 years?" the dream child would whisper. "What did you do with my life?" A sharp knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Before she could respond, Adrian swept into the chamber without waiting for permission, something that would have earned any other. Subject to severe reprimand, but which Marguerite had long ago given up trying to correct. The princess wore a riding dress of deep green velvet, her hair already pinned up for the day, though several rebellious strands had already escaped to frame her face. There was mud on her boots. She had been out riding before dawn again, something else that drove the court advisors to distraction, but which Adrian refused to stop doing. "Mother, we need to talk about the petition hearings." Adrian's voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing others of it as a courtesy. "I want to change how we conduct them. The current system is archaic and cruel." Marguerite turned from the window, studying her daughter with the mix of affection and unease that had characterized their relationship since Adrian was old enough to form opinions. The girl had always possessed an uncomfortable sense of justice, a tendency to champion the downtrodden that seemed to come from nowhere in the royal bloodline. It was one of the many small things that reminded Marguerite that this child had not been born into privilege, even if she couldn't remember anything before it. "What changes do you propose?" Marguerite kept her voice neutral, though her stomach had already begun its familiar churning. These conversations with Adrian always felt like walking across a frozen lake, never quite sure when the ice would crack beneath her feet. "The petitioners wait for hours in that freezing hall, standing like cattle while we sit in comfort deciding their fates. It's degrading." Adrian paced as she spoke, her hands gesturing sharply, "and we only hear a fraction of the cases. The rest are dismissed by clerks who have never even looked these people in the eye. I want to change the schedule. Give more time. Actually listen instead of just performing monarchy." The words hit Marguerite like small stones. Actually listen. As if the last 18 years hadn't been one long exercise in not listening, in not hearing the voice inside her own head that whispered murderer every time she held Adrian's hand, in not acknowledging the questions that haunted every tender moment between them. "The petition system has functioned this way for generations," Marguerite said carefully. "Your father never saw reason to change it. My father is dead." Adrian stopped pacing and fixed those unsettling amber eyes on her mother. And with respect, he also never bothered to notice that half the kingdom was starving while the other half threw banquets. "I'm not interested in maintaining traditions that serve no one but our own comfort." There it was again, that fierce, uncompromising morality that seemed to burn in Adrian like a constant flame. Marguerite wondered, Not for the first time, if this was something inherited from the woman who had abandoned her baby on castle steps. What kind of person did that? What desperation or calculation had driven someone to leave an infant in the cold and walk away? The note had been brief, almost curt in its desperation. I cannot keep her. Please show mercy. No name. No explanation. Just a plea from someone who clearly expected none of their requests to be honored. Marguerite had burned that note the same night, watching the parchment curl and blacken in the fireplace while Adrienne nursed at a wet nurse's breast in the next room. Helwise had disposed of the real princess's body. Somewhere the queen had never asked about and didn't want to know. They had never spoken of it again. Not once in 18 years. The midwife had died 3 winters ago, taking the secret to whatever judgment waited beyond this world. Now only Marguerite carried the weight of that night, and it was getting heavier. Mother? Adrienne's voice had softened slightly, concern creeping into the edges. Are you well? You look pale. I'm fine, just tired. The lie came easily now, after years of practice. We can discuss the petition reforms this afternoon. But Adrienne, you must understand that change cannot happen overnight. The nobles will resist anything that threatens their position. Then we'll deal with the nobles. Adrienne moved closer, and for a moment she looked so young, so full of conviction that the world could be bent to match her vision of justice. You've always taught me that our position comes with responsibility, that we serve the kingdom, not ourselves. I'm simply taking that lesson seriously. The words landed like an accusation, though Adrienne meant them as gratitude. Marguerite had indeed taught her that, had poured every lesson about duty and honor and service into this girl who was not her daughter, as if enough virtue could somehow balance the scales of that original sin. But it hadn't worked. It had only created a young woman whose moral clarity was so sharp it cut anyone who stood too close. A commotion in the courtyard below made both women turn toward the window. A small group had gathered near the kitchen entrance, servants clustering around something Marguerite couldn't quite see from this angle. Then the crowd parted, and she caught sight of a woman, thin to the point of skeletal, dressed in rags that might have once been a merchant's traveling cloak, being supported by 2 kitchen boys who looked uncertain whether they should be helping or calling the guards. Someone's collapsed, Adrienne said, already moving toward the door. I should see if they need assistance. Wait. Marguerite's voice came out sharper than intended. Something about the woman's posture, even collapsed and clearly ill, had sent a spike of irrational fear through her chest. Send a servant. It's not appropriate for you to. But Adrienne was already gone, her boots echoing down the corridor, with that same restless energy that never let her sit still, never let her simply observe when she could act. Marguerite stood alone in her chamber, watching through the window as her daughter reached the courtyard and knelt beside the collapsed woman. Even from this distance, she could see Adrienne speaking urgently to the servants, taking charge of the situation with the easy authority of someone who had never doubted her right to command. The sick woman lifted her head, just for a moment, just long enough for the weak morning sun to catch her profile, and Marguerite's heart stopped beating, because even after 18 years, even wasted by illness and hardship, she recognized that face. Marguerite's knees threatened to buckle beneath her, and she gripped the window ledge so hard her knuckles turned white. It couldn't be. The odds were impossible. Thousands of women passed through Ravensmont's territories every year. Merchants, pilgrims, refugees fleeing conflicts in neighboring kingdoms. There was no reason, no logical explanation for why this particular woman would appear now, after 18 years of silence, unless fate itself had a cruel sense of timing. The queen forced herself to breathe, to think past the panic that was threatening to swallow her whole. Perhaps she was mistaken. Perhaps illness and desperation had a way of making all suffering people look alike, and her guilt-riddled mind was simply projecting familiar features onto a stranger's face. She needed to be certain before she allowed terror to dictate her actions. But even as these rational thoughts formed, her body was already moving toward the door, her feet carrying her down the winding stairs toward the courtyard with a speed that would have shocked the servants who usually saw their queen gliding through halls with measured, regal grace. By the time Marguerite reached the kitchen courtyard, Adrienne had already ordered the woman moved into the servants' quarters. The princess stood near the door, speaking in low, urgent tones with Martha, the head cook, a robust woman with flour perpetually dusted across her apron who had worked in the castle kitchens for 35 years. Martha's face held the particular expression of someone trying to explain practical limitations to royalty who had never needed to consider such things. "Your Highness, with respect, we don't have the facilities to care for someone this ill," Martha was saying, wringing her hands in her apron. "She needs a physician, proper medicine, a clean room with a fire. The servants' quarters are cold and damp, and whatever sickness she's carrying could spread to the others." "Then we'll move her to the guest chambers," Adrienne replied, her tone brooking no argument. "And summon the royal physician immediately. This woman is clearly starving and exhausted. How long has she been at our gates?" "She arrived just before dawn, Highness. Said she'd been traveling for weeks looking for work. Collapsed before she could even state her business properly." Martha glanced past Adrienne and spotted the queen approaching, her expression transforming into one of relief at the arrival of someone who might talk sense into the princess. "Your Majesty, perhaps you could explain to Her Highness that we cannot simply—" "Where is she now?" Marguerite interrupted, her voice coming out more forceful than intended. Both women turned to stare at her, surprise evident on their faces. The queen rarely involved herself in matters of household management, preferring to leave such details to the capable hands of her staff. The woman who collapsed. "Where have you taken her?" "To the small room behind the kitchens, Your Majesty," Martha answered, confusion creeping into her tone. "But she's in no state for visitors, delirious with fever, speaking nonsense. The physician should see her first before—" Marguerite was already moving past them, ignoring the startled looks, ignoring Adrienne's called question about what was wrong. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might crack bone. The small room behind the kitchens was used for storing preserves and dried herbs, barely large enough for the narrow cot someone had dragged in, and the single chair positioned beside it. The air smelled of thyme and rosemary, and underneath it all, the sour-sweet scent of serious illness. The woman lay motionless on the cot, her breathing shallow and rapid. Someone had covered her with a thin blanket, but it did little to hide how wasted her body had become. Her skin stretched tight over prominent bones, her collarbones jutting out like knife blades beneath the threadbare fabric of her dress. Her hair, which might have once been a rich auburn, now hung in lank, graying strands around a face that looked decades older than it should. But the bone structure was unmistakable. The shape of her jaw, the arch of her brows, the way her hands rested on the blanket with the fingers slightly curled. Marguerite had seen this woman only once before, 18 years ago, in a moment of desperate curiosity that had nearly destroyed her. 3 weeks after, that terrible night, unable to bear the questions anymore, she had ordered her most trusted guard to investigate, to find out who had left a baby on the castle steps. The guard had returned with a name and an address. A young seamstress named Lisa, who had lived in the merchant quarter, who had disappeared from her rooms the same night the baby appeared, leaving behind unpaid rent and unfinished commissions. The guard had found a neighbor who remembered Lisa had been pregnant, had been desperate, had been seen arguing with a man who never came back. The neighbor had shown the guard a small portrait Lisa had traded for bread when money grew tight. Marguerite had burned that portrait too, but not before memorizing every line of that face. And now here it was, again, ravaged by time and hardship, but unmistakably the same woman. The mother, the real mother, come back like a ghost made flesh to claim what had been taken. "Mother, what's wrong?" Adrienne's voice came from the doorway, sharp with concern. "You look like you've seen a specter. Do you know this woman?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them could possibly understand yet. Marguerite turned slowly, schooling her features into something resembling calm, though her mind was racing through possibilities and consequences like a mouse in a maze with no exit. If she said yes, Adrienne would ask how, would ask why, would begin pulling at threads that would unravel everything. If she said no, she would have to watch this woman possibly recover, possibly speak, possibly remember the baby she had left behind and recognize the princess standing 3 feet away. "No," Marguerite heard herself say, the lie tasting like ash. "I don't know her. But any subject of the kingdom deserves our care. You were right to bring her inside, Adrienne. Send for the physician as you planned." Adrienne studied her for a long moment, those amber eyes searching her mother's face, with an intensity that made Marguerite want to look away, but knowing that would only deepen suspicion. Finally, the princess nodded and turned to relay orders to a hovering servant. As soon as her daughter's back was turned, Marguerite looked down at the unconscious woman again and felt the room tilt slightly around her. Lisa's eyes fluttered open, just for a second, just long enough for her gaze to focus on Marguerite's face with a clarity that suggested the fever hadn't completely stolen her. Awareness. Her cracked lips moved, forming words that came out as barely a whisper, but which Marguerite heard as clearly as if they had been shouted. "My baby. I left my baby here. I came back for my baby." The words hit Marguerite like a physical blow. Her vision grayed at the edges, and she felt her own lips moving in response, though no sound came out. Behind her, Adrienne was still speaking with the servant, her voice bright with plans for the woman's care, completely oblivious to the devastating confession that had just been made. Lisa's eyes drifted closed again, her brief moment of lucidity fading back into fevered unconsciousness, but the damage was done. She knew. She remembered. And when she recovered enough to speak clearly, to tell her story to anyone who would listen, everything would shatter. Marguerite straightened, forcing her hands to stop trembling, forcing her breathing to steady. She had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before this woman would be strong enough to speak coherently, before she would look around this castle and potentially recognize something in Adrienne's face that would confirm her worst suspicions or best hopes. The Queen had spent 18 years building a life on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation was cracking beneath her feet with audible, terrifying finality. "Mother?" Adrienne had turned back, was watching her with growing concern. "You're pale as death. Should I call for your own physician?" "No, I'm fine, just..." Marguerite paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Just reminded of how fragile life is, how quickly circumstances can change. "Promise me something, Adrienne. Anything. Promise me that no matter what you learn about your past, about your family, you'll remember that love is more powerful than blood." The words came out before Marguerite could stop them, desperate and raw and far too revealing. Adrienne's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "I don't understand." "What are you talking about?" On the cot, Lisa stirred slightly, her lips moving again in silent conversation with whatever dreams or memories the fever had dragged to the surface, and Marguerite realized with crystalline, horrible clarity that her time for controlling this story had just run out. For 3 days, Lisa drifted between consciousness and delirium, while Marguerite haunted the corridors outside her room like a condemned woman waiting for the executioner's call. The royal physician, an elderly man named Godfrey, who had served the castle for 40 years, diagnosed severe malnutrition, exhaustion, and a lung infection that he treated with poultices and herbal tinctures that smelled of mustard and camphor. He gave the woman a 50-50 chance of survival, delivered this prognosis with clinical detachment, and suggested that perhaps the merciful outcome would be for her to slip away peacefully in her sleep. Marguerite had never wanted anyone dead before. Not truly. Not even Edmund during the worst years of their marriage, when his disappointment in her inability to produce an heir had curdled into barely concealed resentment. But now, standing in the cold hallway listening to Godfrey's assessment, she felt a dark, shameful hope coil in her chest. If Lisa died, the secret died with her. The threat would be eliminated. Adrienne would never need to know that everything she believed about herself was a lie constructed on the foundation of another child's death. But Lisa didn't die. By the 4th day, her fever had broken, leaving her weak but lucid. Adrienne had taken to visiting the sick woman twice daily, bringing broth from the kitchens and sitting beside the cot to read aloud from books of poetry and philosophy. Marguerite watched these visits from a distance, her stomach churning with anxiety every time her daughter disappeared through that doorway. She had tried to discourage the attention, suggesting that Adrienne had more important duties than nursing a common traveler back to health, but her objections had only made the princess more determined. "She has no one else," Adrienne had said, her voice carrying that stubborn edge that meant argument was useless. "And she's kind, Mother, even barely able to speak. She thanks everyone who helps her." When was the last time someone in this castle expressed genuine gratitude instead of the practiced courtesy we're used to? The observation had stung more than it should have. Marguerite wondered what kind of person she had become, that her own daughter could see goodness in a stranger but questioned whether the queen herself understood basic human decency. The irony was suffocating. Adrienne's fierce morality, her instinct to protect and help, these were the very qualities that would make the coming revelation so devastating. A girl who believed so deeply in truth and justice would never forgive a lie this large. On the 5th day, Marguerite could bear the waiting no longer. She chose an hour when Adrienne was occupied with the kingdom's accounts, when the servants were busy with afternoon tasks, when the corridor outside the small room would be empty of witnesses. Her hands shook as she pushed open the door, and she had to pause a moment to steady herself before stepping inside. Lisa was sitting up in bed, propped against thin pillows, holding a cup of water in both hands. She looked marginally better than she had days ago, though better was a relative term. Her face still held the hollowed-out look of someone who had gone hungry for far too long, and her eyes seemed too large for her skull, giving her an unsettling, otherworldly appearance. When those eyes lifted to meet Marguerite's gaze, the queen saw immediate recognition flicker across the woman's features. "Your Majesty." Lisa's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, scraped raw from days of fever-induced rambling. She made an awkward attempt to bow her head, sloshing water from the cup. "I apologize. I should not be taking up space in your castle. As soon as I'm strong enough to walk, You came here looking for your daughter." Marguerite cut through the pleasantries with surgical precision, closing the door behind her and leaning against it as if her body could prevent truth from escaping this room. 18 years ago, you left a baby on the castle steps. You want her back." The bluntness of the statement seemed to knock the air from Lisa's lungs. The cup slipped from her fingers. Water, spreading across the blanket in a dark stain that neither woman acknowledged. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was their breathing, sharp and shallow, like animals circling each other in a space too small for both of them to survive. "I don't want her back," Lisa finally said, and the words carried so much pain that Marguerite felt it like a physical sensation in her own chest. "I gave up that right the night I left her in the cold. I just needed to know, needed to see that she was alive, that someone took her in, that she didn't die because of my cowardice. You were desperate." The words escaped Marguerite before she could consider their implications, before she could remember that showing this woman any sympathy was the height of foolishness. "You thought you were saving her." Lisa's eyes filled with tears that spilled over immediately, cutting tracks through the grime still clinging to her face despite the servants' attempts to bathe her. "I was 15 years old and pregnant by a merchant's son who swore he loved me and then disappeared the moment I told him about the baby. My parents had died the winter before. I had no money, no family, no way to feed myself, let alone a child. I thought if I left her somewhere wealthy, somewhere with resources, she might have a chance. I know that doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses leaving a baby in the cold. But I didn't know what else to do." The story poured out of her in a desperate rush, 18 years of guilt, finding release in this unlikely confession to the one person who could never forgive her because she was the one person who truly understood what it meant to make an impossible choice in the darkness. Marguerite listened, each word landing like stones in her stomach, building weight that threatened to drag her under. "I've spent every year since wondering if she survived," Lisa continued, her voice breaking. "Wondering if she was warm, if she was loved, if abandoning her was an act of mercy, or the worst cruelty I could have inflicted. I tried to forget, tried to build a life, but you can't forget something like that. It lives in you, eats at you. So I came back finally, just to know, just to find out if a child died because of my selfishness. She didn't die. The admission came out before Marguerite could stop it, driven by some perverse need to end this woman's suffering, even as she knew it would only transfer that suffering elsewhere. The baby was found, was taken in. She survived. Lisa's face transformed, grief giving way to something that looked like desperate hope. She's alive? Truly? You're not just saying that to comfort me. I never comfort out of kindness. Marguerite heard the bitterness in her own voice, harsh and unforgiving. Yes, she's alive, and she's had a good life, better than you could have given her. So your guilt can be assuaged. You made the right choice, if there was a right choice to be made in that situation. Can I? Lisa hesitated, the question clearly terrifying in its audacity. Can I know what became of her? Just her name. Just something I can carry with me when I leave. A piece of knowledge to replace the not knowing that's been poisoning me all these years. This was the moment. The cliff edge. Marguerite could lie, could invent a servant's daughter who had been adopted by a kind family and now lived happily in some distant village, could send Lisa away with a comfortable fiction that would preserve everyone's peace. But as she opened her mouth to construct that lie, the door behind her swung open without warning, and Adrienne's voice filled the small room with genuine warmth. Lisa, you're sitting up. Godfrey said it would be another week before you had the strength, but you're proving him wrong already. I brought you fresh bread from the kitchens, and some of that honey you said reminded you of your childhood. The princess swept into the room, carrying a tray, her face bright with the uncomplicated pleasure of seeing someone recover from illness. Then she noticed her mother and stopped short, confusion clouding her features. Mother? I didn't know you were visiting. Is something wrong? Marguerite turned to look at her daughter, at this girl who was not her daughter, standing there with bread and honey for a dying woman who had no idea she was staring at the child she had abandoned 18 years ago. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable once you knew to look for it. The same arch, too. The eyebrows. The same way they both tilted their heads slightly when confused. The same long fingers that moved expressively when they spoke. And Lisa was looking. Her gaze had locked onto Adrienne's face with an intensity that suggested she was seeing a ghost or a miracle, or perhaps both at once. The color drained from her cheeks, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Just a small broken noise that might have been the beginning of a name or a prayer, or simply the sound. Grief makes when it finally finds what it's been searching for. The tray slipped from Adrienne's hands before she could register what was happening, the wooden plate clattering against stone with a sharp crack that seemed to break whatever spell had frozen all three women in place. Bread rolled across the floor, honey spreading in a golden pool that caught the afternoon light streaming through the single narrow window. But none of them moved to clean it. They simply stood there, locked in a tableau of recognition and horror, and something far more complicated than either emotion alone could convey. Lisa's hand had flown to her mouth, pressing hard against her lips as if she could physically stop the words that wanted to escape. Her eyes, those fever-bright eyes that had seen too much suffering, moved across Adrienne's face with a hunger that was painful to witness. She was memorizing features, cataloging similarities, searching for confirmation of what her heart had already recognized, but her mind refused to accept. When she finally lowered her hand, it was shaking so violently she had to tuck it beneath the blanket to hide the tremor. I apologize, Your Highness, Lisa managed, her voice strangled. I'm still weak. Seeing you so suddenly, I was overcome. Your kindness has been more than I deserve. Adrienne crossed the room quickly, her boots tracking through the spilled honey, and knelt beside the cot with the easy grace of someone who had never been taught that princesses didn't kneel on dirty floors. Don't apologize. You've been through so much. Here, let me help you lie back down. You shouldn't be exerting yourself yet. Her hands were gentle as she guided Lisa back against the pillows, adjusting the blanket with an attentiveness that made Marguerite's throat close with unshed tears. The queen watched this interaction with a detachment that felt like drowning in slow motion. Her daughter was touching the woman who had given birth. To her, completely unaware that every gesture of comfort was a reunion neither of them understood. And Lisa, this woman who had spent 18 years drowning in guilt and what-ifs, was being cared for by the child she had abandoned, by the living proof that sometimes the cruelest decisions led to miraculous outcomes. The irony was so painful it felt like a blade sliding between Marguerite's ribs. "Mother, could you send for a servant to clean this?" Adrienne glanced over her shoulder, her expression still puzzled by the tension she clearly sensed but couldn't identify. "And perhaps ask Godfrey to prepare a calming tea?" Lisa seems agitated. "Of course." Marguerite forced the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing. She needed to leave this room before she shattered completely, before the weight of all these intersecting lies crushed her into something unrecognizable. But as she turned toward the door, Lisa's voice stopped her. "Your Majesty, wait. Please." The woman's tone carried an urgency that made even Adrienne look up in surprise. "I need to tell you something, both of you. Something I should have said days ago but was too frightened to speak aloud." Every muscle in Marguerite's body tensed. This was it, the moment when everything would unravel. She could feel Adrienne's curious gaze on her back, could sense her daughter's mind already working to understand why this confession required the Queen's presence, why a dying peasant woman would need to confess anything to royalty. The urge to run was overwhelming, but running would only make Adrienne more suspicious. So Marguerite turned back slowly, arranging her face into a mask of polite attention, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. 18 years ago, Lisa began, then stopped, her courage visibly faltering. She looked at Adrienne, then at Marguerite, then down at her hands twisted in the blanket. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. 18 years ago, I did something unforgivable. I left my newborn daughter on the steps of this castle because I had no way to care for her. I was 15, alone, terrified. I thought I was giving her a chance at life, but I've never known if she survived or if my cowardice killed her. The silence that followed was so complete that Marguerite could hear her own pulse in her ears, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to count down the seconds until impact. Adrienne had gone very still, her hand frozen where it rested on the edge of Lisa's cot. The princess's face cycled through emotions too quickly to name: shock, confusion, pity, and something else. Something that looked dangerously close to the beginning of understanding. "That's why you came back," Adrienne said slowly, her voice careful in the way of someone navigating terrain that might collapse beneath them at any moment. "You came to find out what happened to her." "Yes." Lisa's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I know I have no right to answers, no right to anything, but the not knowing has been killing me slowly for 18 years. And I thought if I could just learn whether she lived or died, I could finally breathe again." Adrienne stood abruptly, pacing toward the window with that restless energy that always overtook her when confronted with injustice or suffering she couldn't immediately fix. Marguerite watched her daughter's profile against the afternoon light, seeing the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. When Adrienne finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "What you did was born of desperation, not cruelty. I can't imagine the impossible choice you faced at 15 years old, with no support and no options." She turned back to face Lisa, and Marguerite saw tears tracking down her daughter's face, unchecked and unashamed. "And I can tell you that your daughter lived. She was found and cared for. She grew up safe and loved. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She made a sound that was half sob, half gasp, her whole body curling forward as if she could no longer support the weight of relief mixed with grief. "Thank you," she managed between ragged breaths. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you. I don't deserve this peace, but thank you." Adrienne moved back to the cot, kneeling again and taking Lisa's hands in her own. The gesture was so tender, so full of uncomplicated compassion, that Marguerite had to look away. Her daughter had always possessed this quality, this ability to see past social barriers and offer comfort without calculation. The Queen had sometimes wondered if it was a reaction to being raised in the cold formality of court, a rebellion against the emotional distance that characterized most royal relationships. Now she understood it was something deeper, something inherited from a woman who had made the hardest decision of her life out of love, rather than selfishness. "I want to help you," Adrian was saying, her voice steady despite the tears. "You've been through so much. Let us give you a place here, at least until you're fully recovered. And then, if you want, we can help you find work, give you resources to start over. Your past doesn't have to define your future." "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly. I don't deserve." Lysa's protests were weak, overtaken by exhaustion and the emotional toll of her confession. Her eyes drifted, closed, her breathing evening out as sleep claimed her with the suddenness of the very ill. Within moments, she was unconscious, her face finally relaxing into something approaching peace. Adrian stood slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she looked at Marguerite, the Queen saw her daughter's expression transform from compassion to confusion. "Mother, you knew about this, didn't you? That's why you've been acting so strangely these past few days. You knew she was the woman who left the baby, and you didn't tell me." The accusation in those words was gentle, but unmistakable. Marguerite felt something inside her chest crack just a little wider. "I suspected," she admitted, "because some truths were easier than others. But I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to burden you with someone else's tragic history." "Burden me?" Adrian's voice rose slightly, frustration creeping in around the edges. "Mother, that baby girl grew up somewhere in this kingdom. She's 18 years old now, the same age as me. Don't you think she deserves to know her mother is here? That the woman who gave her life is desperately seeking forgiveness and closure?" The question hung between them, like a sword suspended by a thread. Marguerite opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she possibly say? That the baby and Adrian were the same person? That her daughter was standing here advocating for her own reunion with her biological mother while completely unaware of the devastating truth? That Marguerite herself had been living a lie so large it had consumed her entire existence? "We'll discuss this later," Marguerite finally managed, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Right now, I need to attend to some matters. Stay with her if you wish, but don't tire yourself." She left before Adrian could protest, walking through the corridors with measured steps that wanted to break into a run. Her chambers felt impossibly far away, and when she finally reached them and closed the door, she allowed herself to collapse against it, sliding down until she sat on the cold floor with her knees pulled to her chest. The sobs came then, violent and silent, shaking her entire body with the force of 18 years of suppressed grief and guilt, finally demanding to be acknowledged. Somewhere in the castle, her daughter sat beside the woman who had given birth to her, both of them unaware that they had already found what they were seeking. And Marguerite understood with terrible clarity that she would have to be the one to destroy that mercy. 3 weeks passed in a kind of suspended agony that Marguerite had never experienced before, not even during those terrible months after the switch when every footstep in the corridor made her certain that discovery had finally come. Lissa recovered slowly, her body responding to proper food and rest with the resilience of someone who had survived too much to surrender easily. As she grew stronger, she became a fixture in the castle, helping in the kitchens when the cook would allow it, mending torn linens with the skill of someone who had once made a living with needle and thread. The servants grew fond of her quiet gratitude, her gentle manner with the younger maids who reminded her of the girl she had once been. And Adrian spent every free moment in Lissa's company, drawn to the woman with an intensity that terrified Marguerite more with each passing day. The Queen watched them together during meals in the Great Hall, Lissa now well enough to take her place at the lower tables, while Adrian would abandon her position at the head table to sit beside her, their heads bent close in conversation that seemed to flow with an ease that had never existed between mother and daughter. They laughed together. That was what cut deepest. The sound of their shared laughter drifting through the castle corridors felt like a physical wound, like watching her daughter fall in love. with a truth that would destroy everything Marguerite had built. Adrienne had developed a habit of seeking out stories from Lisa's past, hungry for details about a life so different from her own sheltered existence. She wanted to know about the merchant quarter where Lisa had grown up, about the feeling of creating something beautiful with your own hands and selling it to feed yourself, about the freedom and terror of having no safety net beyond your own resourcefulness. And Lisa, perhaps, sensing a kindred spirit or perhaps simply starved for connection after years of isolation, shared these stories with an openness that made Marguerite want to scream warnings that could never be spoken aloud. On a gray morning, when autumn had fully surrendered to winter's advance, Marguerite found herself standing outside the small chapel where she had spent countless hours over the past 18 years, attempting to pray away guilt that seemed to only grow heavier with time. She had come here, seeking answers, seeking some divine guidance about what she should do, but the silence inside those stone walls offered nothing but the echo of her own tortured thoughts. The decision was hers alone to make, and every option led to devastation. She could continue hiding the truth, watching Adrienne grow closer to Lisa until the biological pull between them became impossible to ignore, until someone else noticed the similarities and started asking questions she couldn't answer. She could confess everything now, ripping apart her daughter's sense of identity and her own claim to motherhood in one terrible revelation. Or she could remove the problem entirely, send Lisa away with enough money to start over somewhere distant, eliminating the threat while condemning herself to an even deeper circle of guilt for separating mother and daughter a second time. The sound of urgent footsteps made her turn. One of the younger servants, a girl named Beatrice who worked in the kitchens, was running toward her with a lack of decorum that suggested genuine emergency. The girl's face was flushed, her breath coming in gasps that created small clouds in the cold air. "Your Majesty," Beatrice panted, executing a clumsy curtsy while still trying to catch her breath. "You must come quickly. It's the princess. She's discovered something in the old records room, and she's demanding to speak with you immediately. She seems very upset." Marguerite's blood turned to ice in her veins. The records room, where birth registries were kept, where careful hands had once altered entries to reflect a princess born on a specific night to a queen who had been in labor for hours. The forgery had been meticulous, performed by a clerk who had been paid handsomely and who had died of a winter fever 2 years later, taking his knowledge to the grave. But what if there had been a draft, a discarded page, some piece of evidence that survived? She followed Beatrice through the castle with a composure that cost her everything to maintain, her mind racing through possibilities and excuses and desperate plans. The records room was in the oldest part of the castle, a cold stone chamber lined with shelves holding leather-bound volumes that documented centuries of births, deaths, marriages, and land transfers. Adrienne stood in the center of the room, surrounded by open books and scattered papers, her face pale with an emotion Marguerite couldn't immediately identify. Beside her stood Lisa, looking confused and frightened in equal measure. "Mother." Adrienne's voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant she was holding back something explosive. "I need you to explain something to me. I was looking through the birth records because Lisa mentioned she thought her daughter was born in the spring, and I wanted to see if there was any record of foundlings from that year. Any record of a baby being brought to the castle." Marguerite's mouth went dry. She forced herself to meet her daughter's eyes, to not look away, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "And what did you find?" "Nothing." The single word carried the weight of an accusation. "There's no record of any foundling being brought to the castle 18 years ago. No notation of any kind about an abandoned infant." Which is strange, don't you think? Because castle records are meticulous about such things. Every beggar seeking shelter, every traveler requesting aid, every transaction is documented. So why would there be no record of a baby? Because there was no baby to record, Marguerite's mind supplied. Because the baby who arrived that night became you, and you already had an entry in the birth registry as the legitimate princess of Ravensmont. But she couldn't say that, couldn't speak the words that would detonate this carefully constructed lie. Perhaps the clerk who was on duty that night failed in his responsibilities, Marguerite offered, hearing how weak the explanation sounded, even as it left her lips. Or perhaps the record exists in a different volume, misfiled or overlooked. I've checked every volume from that year and the 2 years surrounding it. Adrienne's hands were shaking now, papers rustling between her fingers. Nothing. It's as if that baby never existed, as if someone deliberately ensured there would be no documentation of her arrival. She paused, her eyes searching her mother's face with an intensity that felt like being flayed alive. Why would someone do that, Mother? Why would anyone want to hide the fact that an infant was found and taken in? Lisa had gone very still, her gaze moving between the two royal women with growing horror as understanding began to dawn across her features. She took a step backward, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a shelf. "No," she whispered, so softly it was barely audible. "No, that's not possible." "What's not possible?" Adrienne turned to her, concern immediately overtaking her anger at the sight of Lisa's distress. "Are you feeling ill? Should I call for Godfrey?" "The date." Lisa's voice was stronger now, but it shook with an emotion that Marguerite recognized as the moment before everything collapsed. "When is your birthday, Your Highness? The exact date?" Adrienne frowned, confused by the question. "The 3rd day of April. Why does that matter?" "That's the night I left her." Lisa's eyes were fixed on Adrienne now, wide and disbelieving, seeing what she had somehow missed despite spending weeks in the girl's company. "That's the exact night I left my daughter on these castle steps. April 3rd, 18 years ago. And you're saying you were born that same night?" The air in the room seemed to compress, becoming too thick to breathe. Marguerite watched her daughter's face cycle through confusion, resistance, and then a terrible dawning comprehension that stripped away every certainty she had ever held about her identity. Adrienne's hand moved to her chest, pressing hard against her ribs as if she could physically hold herself together through the force of will alone. "That's a coincidence," Adrienne said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Plenty of babies are born on the same night. It doesn't mean anything." "Look at her, Your Highness." Lisa's voice broke on the words. "Really look at her. You have the same way of tilting your head when you're thinking. The same long fingers. The same exact shade of eyes that my mother had, that I used to see in my own reflection before grief changed me. I've been staring at my own daughter for 3 weeks without recognizing her because I couldn't let myself believe that the universe could be that cruel or that merciful." Adrienne turned to Marguerite, and the look in her eyes was something the queen would carry to her grave. It was the look of a person watching their entire world collapse, watching every truth they had built their identity upon revealed as a carefully constructed lie. "Mother," she whispered, and the words sounded like a question and an accusation and a plea all at once. "Tell me this is insane. Tell me these are just terrible coincidences and that I'm really your daughter. Please." Marguerite opened her mouth to speak, to offer the comfort of a lie, but the words wouldn't come. She had spent 18 years lying, and her capacity for falsehood had finally, catastrophically, run dry. The silence stretched between them, and in that silence, Adrienne found her answer. The sound Adrienne made was not quite human. It started somewhere deep in her chest and emerged as a wounded keen that seemed to echo off the stone walls of the records room, bouncing back at them like an accusation multiplied 1,000 times. She stumbled backward, her legs hitting a chair that clattered to the floor, the crash breaking whatever paralysis had held all 3 women frozen in place. Papers scattered from her grip, floating to the ground like snow, each one a meaningless document that suddenly mattered less than the truth written across Marguerite's guilty silence. "Say something." Adrienne's voice came out raw, scraped clean of the careful refinement that years of royal training had instilled. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me this is madness. Mother, please just say something." But what words existed for this moment? Marguerite had rehearsed confessions in her mind countless times over 18 years, imagining scenarios where the truth emerged and she could explain her reasoning, justify her actions, make someone understand the impossible position she had been in. None of those imagined speeches seemed adequate now, standing here watching her daughter fragment in real time. The truth was too large, too devastating to be softened by explanation. There was a baby born that night, Marguerite finally managed, each word feeling like glass in her throat. My daughter, the true princess of Ravensmont. She was born silent, already gone before she could take her first breath. The admission came easier than she expected, as if her body had been waiting 18 years to release this poison. And in the same hour, another baby appeared at our gates, abandoned, alone. The midwife, she made a choice. She made a terrible, merciful, unforgivable choice. Lisa had collapsed against the shelves, her body sliding down until she sat on the cold floor with her knees drawn up, her face buried in her hands. Sobs racked her thin frame, but whether they were grief or relief or some horrible combination of both was impossible to determine. She had spent 18 years believing herself a monster for abandoning her child, only to discover that abandonment had resulted in her daughter becoming royalty. The irony was so cruel, it defied comprehension. You took her. Adrian's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way that meant she was operating on pure shock, her mind not yet able to process the full weight of what she was learning. You took someone else's baby and raised her as your own. You lied to everyone, to father, to me, to the entire kingdom. For 18 years you've been lying about who I am. I was trying to protect you. The words sounded pathetic even as Marguerite spoke them, a justification so insufficient it was almost insulting. Your father needed an heir, the kingdom needed stability, and you needed a home, a family, a chance at life. If I had sent you to an orphanage or left you with a peasant family, you would have grown up in poverty, in hardship. I gave you everything. You gave me a lie. Adrian's shout reverberated through the room, and for the first time in their relationship, Marguerite saw genuine fury in her daughter's eyes. Not the controlled anger of a princess displeased with some minor court infraction, but raw primal rage born of betrayal so fundamental it had shattered her sense of self. You let me believe I belonged here, that this was my birthright, that you were my mother. Everything I am, everything I thought I was, it's all built on a foundation that doesn't exist. I am your mother. Marguerite heard the desperation in her own voice, the pathetic clinging to a title that the last hour had revealed to be stolen. I raised you. I sat with you when you were sick. I taught you to read, to ride, to rule. I loved you every single day for 18 years. Biology doesn't erase that, doesn't it? Adrian's laugh was bitter, broken, because right now, looking at you, I don't know who you are. The woman I thought was my mother would never have been capable of this level of deception, would never have stolen someone else's child and built an entire kingdom's succession on that theft. Who are you? Because you're not the person I thought I knew. The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Marguerite had asked herself the same thing countless times over the years, usually in the darkest hours of the night when guilt made sleep. Impossible. Who was she? A grieving mother who had made an impossible choice? A calculating queen who had prioritized the kingdom's stability over truth? A woman who had convinced herself that love could justify any deception? She had never found a satisfactory answer. Lisa lifted her head from her hands, her face ravaged by tears, but her voice surprisingly steady when she spoke. Your Highness, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I left you in the cold because I was a frightened child who couldn't see any other path forward. The queen took you in because she was a grieving mother who saw a chance to fill an unbearable void. We're both guilty of putting our own needs above your right to know the truth. But please understand, everything she did because she loves you. That much is real. Don't defend her. Adrian's voice cracked on the words. Don't you dare defend the woman who stole 18 years of knowing my real mother from both of us. You spent nearly 2 decades drowning in guilt, thinking you'd condemned your child to death or worse. And I spent those same years living a lie, believing I was someone I'm not. She could have told us the truth at any point. She chose not to. The accusation was irrefutable. Marguerite had indeed chosen silence day after day, year after year, even as that silence had calcified into something that felt permanent, immovable. She had told herself it was for Adrian's protection, for the kingdom's stability. But, standing here now, watching the destruction her choices had wrought, she understood with brutal clarity that she had been protecting herself, protecting her own position, her own claim to motherhood, her own desperate need to believe that love could sanctify theft. What happens now? Adrian's question was directed at no one in particular, thrown out into the space between the three of them like a challenge none of them knew how to meet. Do I remain princess? Continue pretending to be someone I'm not? Or do we announce to the kingdom that their crown princess is actually the bastard daughter of a seamstress? That the entire royal line is fraudulent? That everything they've been told for 18 years is a lie? You are still princess. Marguerite's voice came out stronger than she felt. The law, the kingdom's recognition, the years you've spent training for this role, none of that changes. Your father acknowledged you as his heir. That acknowledgement stands regardless of biology. Does it? Adrian's eyes blazed with something that looked like panic wrapped in fury. Or is that just more convenient fiction you're spinning to protect your position? Because if the truth comes out, if people learn what you did, they won't just question my legitimacy. They'll question everything about this monarchy, every law I might someday pass, every judgment I might make, every child I might have, all of it built on a lie that you started and that I've unknowingly perpetuated just by existing. The weight of that reality settled over the room like a physical presence. Marguerite had considered these implications before, in abstract theoretical ways that never quite touched the visceral truth of it, but hearing them spoken aloud by her daughter, seeing the way that knowledge was crushing Adrian's spirit in real time, made them undeniable. She had not just stolen a child. She had stolen a life, an identity, a future that should have belonged to someone else. And she had stolen from her kingdom too, giving them a princess whose claim to the throne was based on nothing more solid than a dying midwife's desperate substitution. I need time. Adrian was backing toward the door now, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like someone relearning how to inhabit a body that no longer felt like it belonged to them. I need to think. I need to. I don't know what I need, but I can't be in this room anymore. I can't look at either of you. Adrian, please. Marguerite reached out, but her daughter flinched away from the gesture as if the queen's touch might burn. Don't call me that. The words came out as a whisper, devastating in their quiet finality. That name was given to a princess who never existed. I don't know who I am, but I'm starting to suspect I'm not her. She turned and fled the records room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with increasing speed until they faded entirely, leaving behind only the sound of Lissa's continued weeping and Marguerite's ragged breathing. The queen stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway through which her daughter had just disappeared, understanding with terrible clarity that Adrian might never come back. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. For 5 days, Adrian refused to leave her chambers. Servants left food outside her door that went mostly untouched, the trays returned with bread torn into pieces but not eaten, soup gone cold in bowls that showed no signs of having been tasted. Marguerite stood outside that locked door countless times, her hand raised to knock, words of explanation or apology or desperate pleading forming and dissolving on her lips before she could give them voice. What could she possibly say that would make any of this bearable? That would transform theft into something resembling mercy? The castle moved around this central wound with the careful silence of people who sensed catastrophe but didn't yet understand its shape. Rumors spread through the servant quarters in whispers. The princess was ill. The princess had received devastating news. The princess and the queen had quarreled over some matter of state. None of these explanations felt adequate to explain the tension that had settled over Ravensmont like fog, thick and impenetrable and vaguely threatening. Lisa had tried to leave twice, packing her meager belongings and attempting to slip away before dawn, but both times Marguerite had intercepted her, not out of cruelty, though it might have looked that way to outside observers, but because some instinct told the queen that Adrian would need her biological mother before this was over, even if she didn't know it yet. Or perhaps Marguerite simply couldn't bear the thought of being the only person left carrying this secret, the sole guardian of a truth that was crushing her beneath its weight. On the 6th morning, Marguerite woke to find a note slipped under her own chamber door. The handwriting was Adrienne's, but it looked wrong somehow. The usually precise letters, shaky and irregular, as if written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. The message was brief. Meet me in the garden at noon. Come alone. Bring her. The autumn garden was dying in the way all gardens do when winter approaches, flowers surrendering to frost, leaves carpeting the ground in shades of rust and gold. Marguerite arrived early, unable to bear the waiting any longer, and found Lissa already there, standing near the fountain, with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. The seamstress looked even thinner than she had weeks ago, as if the revelation had burned away whatever small progress she'd made toward recovery. They didn't speak. There seemed to be nothing left to say between them, these two women who had irreversibly altered each other's lives without ever intending to meet. They simply stood in the cold garden, watching their breath form clouds in the air, waiting for the girl who belonged to both of them and neither of them. Adrienne appeared exactly at noon, moving through the garden with a deliberateness that suggested each step was a conscious choice rather than natural movement. She had lost weight, Marguerite noticed with a pang of maternal concern that felt absurd given everything else. Her daughter's face was pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep or both. She had dressed simply, without any of the ornate jewelry or elaborate styling that usually marked her. As royalty, in plain wool and linen, with her hair braided simply down her back, she could have been anyone. Perhaps that had been the point. I've spent 5 days trying to understand who I am. Adrienne began without preamble, her voice hoarse from disuse, trying to separate what's real from what's been constructed. And I've realized that most of what I thought was me doesn't actually exist. The princess part, the royal bloodline, the sense of belonging to this place and this role. All fiction, all based on a lie that 2 desperate women told 18 years ago. Adrienne? Marguerite started, but her daughter raised a hand to silence her. I'm not finished. I need to say this while I still have the courage. Adrienne's gaze moved between the 2 women, and Marguerite saw something in her daughter's eyes that looked like grief mixed with a terrible, hard-won clarity. I don't know how to be your daughter, she said, looking at Lissa. I don't know you. You're a stranger who happened to give birth to me, but we share no memories, no history, no foundation for a relationship beyond biological accident. And I hate that I feel that way because I can see how much you're suffering, how much guilt you've carried. But I can't manufacture feelings that don't exist. Lissa's face crumpled, but she nodded, accepting this brutal honesty with more grace than it probably deserved. I understand, she whispered. I never expected anything different, just knowing you're alive. Seeing the woman you've become, that's more than I deserve. Adrienne turned to Marguerite, and the queen felt her heart begin to hammer with anticipation and dread. This was the moment, the judgment, the reckoning she had been dreading for 18 years. And you, Adrienne said, her voice breaking slightly on the word. You're the only mother I've ever known. You taught me everything, shaped who I am in every meaningful way. When I think of childhood, every memory has you in it, wiping my tears, celebrating my victories, sitting up with me when I was sick, reading to me, teaching me, loving me. Hope flared in Marguerite's chest, painful and desperate, but Adrienne wasn't finished. But you also lied to me every single day of my life. Every time you called me daughter, it was built on a deception. Every time you told me stories about my birth, about how happy you were when I arrived, you were describing a baby who died. Your real daughter, the one you replaced me with. Adrienne's voice hardened. And I don't know if I can forgive that. I don't know if love is enough to balance that scale. The words landed like stones, each one adding weight to the guilt Marguerite already carried. She had known this might be the outcome, had prepared herself for rejection, but preparation did nothing to dull the agony of actually hearing it, of watching her daughter confirm that the relationship they had built over 18 years might not be strong enough to survive the truth of its foundation. "So here's what I've decided," Adrienne continued, and now her voice took on a formal quality that reminded Marguerite painfully of Edmund when he delivered judgments from the throne. "I'm going to remain princess, not because I believe I have any legitimate claim to the title, but because revealing the truth would destabilize the entire kingdom. Innocent people would suffer for our mistakes. That's not justice. That's just spreading the damage wider." Marguerite felt a rush of relief so intense it made her lightheaded, but it died immediately when she saw her daughter's expression. There was more coming. Something harder. "But I can't live here anymore. Can't sit across from you at meals and pretend everything is normal. Can't rule beside you knowing that every moment together is a reminder of what you stole from all three of us." Adrienne's hands clenched at her sides. "I'm going to the Northern Estates, Father's hunting lodge. I'll tell the court I need time to grieve his death properly, that I've been neglecting my mourning for too long. It's far enough away that I won't have to see you regularly, but close enough that I can still perform my duties when necessary." "For how long?" Marguerite's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe forever. Maybe until I can look at you without feeling like I'm standing on ground that might collapse at any moment." Adrienne's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. "I want to forgive you, Mother. Some part of me still loves you so much it physically hurts. But another part of me doesn't know who you are anymore, doesn't know who I am. And I need distance to figure that out." Lisa stepped forward, her voice tentative. "And what about me, Your Highness? What would you have me do?" Adriana looked at her birth mother for a long moment, something complicated passing across her features. "Stay in the castle. Work in the sewing rooms if you want. I'll make sure you're provided for. Not as payment or apology, but because you deserve a chance to rebuild your life. Maybe someday, when I've figured out how to be myself, we can try to know each other. But not now. Right now, you're just another reminder of everything I've lost." The cruelty of that statement seemed to hit all three of them simultaneously. Adrienne had lost her identity. Lisa had lost 18 years with her daughter, and Marguerite had lost the relationship she had built her entire existence around, the one piece of grace she had managed to create out of that terrible night's tragedy. They stood in the dying garden, three women bound together by blood and lies and love and grief, none of them knowing how to move forward but unable to go back. "I leave tomorrow at dawn," Adrienne said finally, stepping backward as if physical distance might make this easier. "Don't come to say goodbye. I can't bear it. Just let me go." She turned and walked away, her straight back and measured steps, a testament to years of training in maintaining composure, even when the world was collapsing. Marguerite watched her daughter disappear into the castle and understood with devastating finality that this was her punishment. Not death, not public shame, but this, watching the person she loved most in the world walk away, knowing that her own choices had made that departure necessary, knowing that love, however genuine, couldn't erase the damage of 18 years of lies. Lisa's hand found hers in the cold air, and for a moment they stood together, two mothers mourning the same daughter for entirely different reasons. Then Lisa pulled away gently and followed Adrienne's path back to the castle, leaving Marguerite alone in the garden where frost was already beginning to claim the last struggling blooms. The queen sank onto a stone bench, her hands pressed against her face, and finally allowed herself to weep for all three of them. For the baby who died, for the baby who lived, and for the terrible, irrevocable choices that had brought them all to this moment of devastating, incomplete truth. Sometimes the most devastating question isn't whether we made the right choice, but whether any right choice existed at all. Queen Marguerite stood at an impossible crossroads where every path led to someone's destruction, and she chose the one that seemed like mercy in the moment. But mercy and truth are rarely the same thing, and 18 years of love built on a foundation of lies proved that even the purest intentions can create wounds that never fully heal. So ask yourself, if you were holding a dead child in one arm and a living stranger's baby in the other, with the weight of a kingdom's future pressing down on your shoulders, what would you have done? And more importantly, could you have lived with that choice for 18 years, watching it grow and breathe and call you mother, knowing that one day the truth would demand its reckoning? Adrian's decision to walk away wasn't about punishing the woman who raised her or embracing the woman who gave birth to her. It was about claiming the one thing that had been taken from her since the night she was born, the right to define herself on her own terms. Love doesn't erase deception, but it doesn't disappear because of it either. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all, that we can love someone completely while still needing to leave them, that forgiveness and distance can exist in the same broken heart. The real question isn't whether Marguerite was wrong or Lissa was wrong, or even whether Adrian's response was fair. The question is, what do we owe the people we love when the truth and their happiness stand in opposition? And can a family built on lies ever become real? Or does knowing the foundation is cracked mean the whole structure has to fall? If this story made you feel something, made you question what you would do in an impossible situation, then it deserves to be heard by others who might need to sit with these same uncomfortable truths. Hit that like button, share this with someone who appreciates stories that don't offer easy answers, and subscribe to this channel for more tales that will make you think long after they end. Because the best stories aren't the ones that make us comfortable. They're the ones that force us to examine the lies we tell ourselves and ask whether love really can justify anything, or whether some truths are too important to bury, no matter how much it costs to dig them up.